This is Hybrid Cognition, a narrated version of my Substack essays and field notes on AI, organizations, leadership, governance, and institutional change. The original article, related notes, and any companion tools are linked in the description. In the first episode, I introduced the idea of hybrid cognition. The claim was that institutional reasoning is no longer exclusively human. In the second episode, I looked at what does that do to agency. If AI systems shape decisions before humans formally make them, then influence and accountability begin to separate. This episode moves to the next question. If cognition is distributed, and if decisions are increasingly co-produced by humans and systems, what happens to leadership authority? For much of modern organizational life, leadership authority has rested on two closely related foundations. The first is analytical capacity. The second is control over the decision process. Leaders were expected to see patterns others couldn't see. They were expected to interpret ambiguity more effectively. They were expected to synthesize complex information into direction. And they were expected to control the process through which decisions were made. What information is reviewed, what options are considered, which risks matter, which alternatives are taken seriously, which recommendations reach the table. In that world, authority and control reinforced each other. The leader was not only the person with formal responsibility, the leader was also expected to be the person, or at least one of the people, with the strongest grasp of the situation. But this model was built on the assumption that was rarely made explicit. It assumed that cognition was human. And because cognition was human, it could be located. It could be associated with roles, positions, expertise, committees, professions, and titles. The senior physician, the executive team, the board, the expert, the strategy lead, the accountable manager. But once reasoning becomes distributed across humans and systems, that assumption begins to weaken. The leader may still be formally accountable, the hierarchy may still exist, the job title may not change, but the cognitive process through which decisions are formed has changed. And that means the basis of authority changes as well. Consider healthcare. In many hospitals, AI systems increasingly enter the room before the physician speaks. They summarize patient histories, they flag risks, they suggest treatment pathways, they prioritize cases, they help structure the medical record. On paper, the clinician remains the accountable professional. The doctor makes the decision, the doctor signs the order, the doctor carries the ethical and professional responsibility. But in practice, the decision environment has already been shaped by systems. The clinician is not reasoning alone. The system has influenced what is visible, what is urgent, what is risky, and what is recommended. Authority remains personal on paper, but in practice it has become hybrid. The same pattern appears at organizational scale. A company may use advanced analytics to detect safety risks, predict failures, prioritize interventions, or identify emerging operational hazards. The executive remains responsible. The board remains accountable. Leaders may even lose their positions when failures occur. But the risk architecture itself, the analytics, the models, the thresholds, the escalation logic, the data pipelines, may receive far less visible scrutiny. This creates a strange situation. Leaders are accountable for decisions and outcomes they no longer fully produce. That sentence is worth sitting with. Leaders are accountable for decisions and outcomes they no longer fully produce. It does not mean leaders are powerless. It does not mean responsibility disappears. It does not mean we should blame the system whenever something goes wrong. But it does mean that leadership authority can no longer rest on the old assumption that the leader is the prime cognitive author of the decision. That assumption is becoming structurally incomplete. The first thing that weakens is the analytical monopoly. A well-designed model can process more data than any individual human. A pattern recognition system can surface correlations that human analysts would not see unaided. A generative system can synthesize material across domains at speed and scale. A decision support system can produce framings, rankings, and recommendations before deliberation even begins. That does not make the system wise. It does not make it trustworthy by default. It does not remove the need for human interpretation. But it does dissolve a core premise of traditional authority, the idea that leadership authority rests on being the most analytically capable actor in the system. In hybrid cognitive systems, the leader may not be the strongest pattern recognizer. The leader may not be the fastest synthesizer. The leader may not even be the first source of a decision frame. The first framing may come from a dashboard, or a risk model, or a forecasting system, or an AI-generated summary, or a recommendation architecture built months earlier by people who are not even in the room. So if authority cannot rest primarily on analytical superiority, where does it move? The second thing that weakens is control over the decision process. In traditional organizations, leaders influence decisions not only by thinking well, but by structuring the process. They decide what is discussed. They decide who participates. They decide which information matters. They decide how risks are framed. They decide which alternatives deserve attention. But when systems pre-structure options, highlight risks, and generate recommendations before human deliberation begins, no individual fully controls the decision architecture. The starting point of reasoning is no longer entirely human-defined. By the time people enter the conversation, the problem may already have been framed. The options may already have been filtered. The risk categories may already have been established. The likely recommendation may already have been salient. Again, this does not remove human agency, but it does change where agency operates. The leader is no longer simply controlling the decision process. The leader is operating inside a decision architecture that may have been shaped by many actors: system designers, data teams, model providers, workflow owners, vendors, governance boards, regulators, and historical data. This creates what I would call a legitimacy gap. Formal authority remains human, influence is increasingly exercised by systems, accountability remains assigned to leaders and boards, but those three things no longer align cleanly. Authority is assigned to people, influence flows through systems. Accountability is triggered when outcomes fail. This is where leadership becomes fragile. Not because leaders are less important, but because the old explanation of leadership authority no longer matches the real structure of decision-making. A leader may sign off on a decision, but if the decision was shaped by models they do not understand, data they did not curate, thresholds that they didn't set, and workflows that they didn't design, then the basis of their authority becomes harder to defend. The organization may still say the leader decided, but a more accurate description may be the system produced a structured field of action and the leader authorized one path within it. That is a different kind of authority. And if we keep pretending it is the old kind, we end up with three structural problems. The first is phantom authority. This is responsibility without full authorship. The leader is formally responsible for a decision they did not fully produce. The second is unclaimed influence. Systems shape outcomes, but no one clearly owns their influence. The third is eroding legitimacy. Decisions become harder to justify coherently when challenged because the official account of how the decision was made does not match how influence actually flowed. This is not simply a communication problem. It is not solved by better messaging. It is not solved by saying humans remain in the loop. The question is not whether a human is somewhere in the process. The question is whether human authority is meaningfully positioned in the process. Where does discretion actually sit? Where can a human challenge the system? Where can the recommendation be overridden? Where are disagreements recorded? Who decides what the system is allowed to optimize? Who is responsible for the architecture, not just the final decision? This is why I think leadership under hybrid cognition has to move beyond control, not because control is irrelevant, but because control is no longer the deepest source of authority. In hybrid cognitive institutions, authority increasingly rests on architecture. By decision architecture, I mean the way a decision process is designed. How problems are framed, who sees which information, in what sequence, how defaults are set, how thresholds are chosen, where system recommendations enter the process, where human discretion remains, how contestation works, how overrides are handled, how accountability is assigned, how the final decision can be explained. This is where leadership authority is moving. From making decisions to designing the conditions under which the decisions are made. From personal analytical dominance to institutional reasoning design. From control over the room to governance over the architecture. That may sound abstract, but it is deeply practical. A leader responsible for an AI-shaped decision domain should be asking, which systems influence this decision? What do they optimize for? What assumptions are embedded in them? Where does human judgment enter? Is that judgment real or a ritual? Can people challenge the system? Can they understand why it recommended what it did? Can accountability be traced in a way that reflects actual influence? If the answer is no, then leadership authority is fragile, even if the formal hierarchy looks strong. This is the central shift. Leadership does not become less important under hybrid cognition, it becomes more architectural. The leader's task is not simply to out-analyze the organization. It is to ensure that the organization's reasoning processes are structured, interpretable, contestable, and legitimate. That requires a different posture. Less heroic certainty, more systemic design. Less personal dominance, more governance. Less reliance on being the smartest person in the room, more responsibility for how the room, the systems, the data, and the decision process work together. This is not a loss of authority. This is a relocation of authority. Authority moves from the person alone to the structures through which human and machine reasoning interact. And this matters because organizations that fail to understand the relocation may drift into dangerous middle states. They may have AI systems shaping decisions, they may have leaders formally accountable. They may have governance documents, they may have ethics principles, they may have oversight committees, but the actual decision architecture may remain unclear. In that environment, leaders can become responsible for outcomes without understanding the systems that produced them. Employees may experience decisions as opaque. Boards may receive summaries without understanding how those summaries were generated. Customers, regulators, or citizens may challenge decisions that the organization struggles to explain. And when that happens, legitimacy no longer follows position. A title is not enough. A committee is not enough. A human-in-the-loop statement is absolutely not enough. Legitimacy follows design. Can the organization show how the design was produced? Can it explain where system influence entered? Can it justify why the system was trusted? Can it show where human judgment mattered? Can it demonstrate that accountability is aligned with influence? This is where leadership beyond control begins. Not with abandoning responsibility, but with becoming more precise about what responsibility now requires. If cognition is distributed, then leadership authority must be anchored in the architecture of that decision. Leaders must understand not only what decisions are made, but how the organization reasons. They must know where systems shape attention, where models shape options, where workflows shape behavior, where metrics shape priorities, where governance shapes legitimacy. The challenge is no longer only to make the right decision, it is to ensure that the system producing decisions can be trusted. That is a much harder task, but it may also be a more realistic description of leadership in the age of hybrid cognition. Because as cognition becomes hybrid, authority no longer follows control, it follows design. If you want to read the original essay, follow the links in the description. I've also included any related field notes, companion tools, and references there. Thanks for listening.